Oh, Q. Q. Okay. Now, E. E. Oh no, there's an ult. Oh no, a second ult. Oh my goodness. Oh, it's a Baron power play. Welcome back to the Pop Docs channel. I am Joseph, one half of the Pop Docs, back with another book review. If you're still here after that horrid introduction with my terrible acting skills, you'll realize now why I never pursued acting as a career. And if you got those references from the introduction, you'll have surmised we are talking in this video about League of Legends, particularly Ruination by Anthony Reynolds, a recent entry in the canon of League of Legends. And in this video, I'll be talking very generally about the plot, giving my thoughts on the general plot in a non-spoiler way, delve into the main characters, some of the supporting characters, what I thought worked, what I thought could have used a little more page time, and then I'll conclude with my final thoughts on the story. I'll rate the story, and then talk about whether or not I would recommend this particular story to those interested in these types of novels, these types of worlds, these types of characters, and these types of stories. But before jumping into Ruination specifically, I want to talk briefly about video games and how video games can expand, enrich their stories, their characters, through the creation of other types of media that tie into the video games. I would not characterize myself, qualify myself as a hardcore gamer, but I have enjoyed playing video games throughout most of my life. One of my favorite video games of all time remains Legend of Dragoon, and I still hope for the news that there is either a sequel in production or a sequel coming out for Legend of Dragoon, because I think that is one of the more underrated games of all time, and for me, it's one of my favorite games of all time. I do miss that journey in that particular game. But most of the games I've played have been on the PC. Most of them have been MMORPGs, beginning with EverQuest. Absolutely adored EverQuest, the worlds. I became enraptured with the different worlds, the different lands, the different people, characters, and story of Norath and its related planes of existence and worlds. But I also played a lot of Warcraft 3 and World of Warcraft after Warcraft 3. And in fact, I played most of the time as an orc hunter and or shaman in World of Warcraft for the Horde, for those viewers out there that also play World of Warcraft. But between these three different properties, one of the cool things I always thought was the lore that was underpinning the play, the gameplay, the characters, the world, and everything. And it wasn't just in-world, in-game lore that the creators of Warcraft and EverQuest provided. There were other types of stories in other forms of the media, particularly in the form of tie-in novels. EverQuest has around 3 novels, I believe, that take place within the world of EverQuest. I have not had an opportunity to read them yet, although they are on my to-be-read list. For viewers of this video that have read those EverQuest novels, jump into those comments there and let me know what to expect, your own view on those particular works in the world of Norath or in its associated planes of existences and other worlds. But I did have the opportunity to read many of the Warcraft novels, and I adored most of them. And I thought the Warcraft novels did a really great job expanding on the stories that were encapsulated and depicted in the video games, as well as expanding on or introducing new characters to the reader, to the player in this realm. And within the milieu of World of Warcraft, I think a lot of the tie-in novels that set up the expansions for World of Warcraft did a really great job of bringing that world to life, adding more nuance to the world of Warcraft. And so when I heard that there was going to be a League of Legends novel about several of the characters from League of Legends, a game I just picked up and started playing fairly avidly. I parenthetically played a lot of Defense of the Ancients, Dota, in my Warcraft 3 days, so very much enjoyed that type of video game. And League of Legends, I just gravitated toward. I've really enjoyed playing it, even though I am adequate at best. But nevertheless, I really enjoy the game, and just as I was excited for each Warcraft novel that came out, I was really excited to hear about Ruination and jump into that book to see whether or not this story would really expand on what I knew from the video game, from the anecdotes, some of the videos that League of Legends has produced to try to expand on the lore, introduce new aspects of the particular game, in a vein similar to how the Warcraft novels really expanded on the lore of the world of Warcraft. So let's turn now to Anthony Reynolds' work, Ruination. First thing I wanted to point out is this book looks beautiful. I love the cover. The back is also very similar, has the sword that Viego, one of the primary characters in this story, one of the playable characters in the game, wields. Although not being a weapon master or a sword master in any way, I always did think this was a little bit of an impractical weapon, as it seems like the crossguard is below the hilt, even though there's a smaller crossguard. It looks like that. I don't know how well that would stop incoming blades. Nevertheless, very cool looking cover, very cool looking sword. It looks great in the game as well. And also on the inside of the dust jacket, there are some great illustrations that really set the tone, the atmosphere of this particular story. But what is this story about? Well, this is a story that takes place in the land of Camavor. And it follows several characters that will be familiar to those that play League of Legends. But at the outset of this story, we are following King Viego, newly crowned king of Camavor. And this is a society that is centered very much around military strength, the exercise of military power, predicated on conquest of neighboring lands, neighboring kingdoms. And so the story generally opens up with a battle, and King Viego and his forces' efforts to subdue their enemies and claim a victory, expand the borders, the strength, the power, the prestige of Camavor and King Viego's fledgling reign here. We typically follow, however, his niece, who is Callista, who is one of the generals, commanders in part of Camavor's military forces. She is beloved by her own troops, her own soldiers. There's a little political machinations going on between different elements of the Camavorian military that plays out in several different subplots. But she's an incredibly capable fighter, incredibly capable strategist, and her fighting force is one of the strongest elements of the Camavorian military. And so ultimately they win the day. This hopefully is not a spoiler, as this takes place within the first several pages of the story. In celebrating their victory, their conquest, tragedy strikes at a celebratory feast. And this tragedy sets King Viego down a very dismal, tragic road. And we actually see very little of King Viego throughout this story. As I mentioned, a lot of this story takes place around Callista, who's torn between the compassion and the love she feels for her uncle, who is now the king, and who is clearly bereft, clearly trapped in this cycle of grief, and has really begun to neglect his duties as king, and has taken on certain strategies, ploys, plots, efforts that seem to run against the needs of this kingdom of Camavor. And so she's really trying to help her uncle through this grief, demonstrate, express her compassion that she feels for what the king is going through, but also trying to ensure that the realm, the kingdom, does not suffer by virtue of what's becoming more and more neglectful behavior on the part of the king. And so Callista ultimately sets out on a globe-trotting adventure to try and find the balance between trying to help her uncle and trying to maintain the kingdom and ensure the stability and future of the kingdom. The other main plot follows a character, let me check my notes here, Urlock Grail. I hope I pronounced that name correctly. This is someone who seems to be training to become some kind of magician or magic wielder. Very high on themselves, very arrogant, believes they are smarter than their teachers, smarter than their colleagues, stronger than their colleagues and their teachers, and that they are destined for a place of high prestige and influence in their particular order. Given this description, it's pretty clear then that Urlock Grail does not hold their colleagues or their teachers in high regard, and this feeling is reciprocated by these different audiences. And we see near the outset of the story the leaders of this order or this school, the teachers of the school. It's not really clear exactly who they are or what they are, but they are the leadership of the organization within which Urlock Grail is practicing, learning, operating, and they essentially banish him to the underworld of this island where this order, this organization keeps a lot of magical relics. And there's very little light, it's very dark, ominous, scary, and he is essentially banished to wander those halls and look after these magical relics with no real hope of advancement, of progress, of expanding his power and influence in this organization. So certainly this seems to be some form of retaliation against Urlock Grail, and it really leads him and sets him on a journey where he is going to try and find a way out of the underworld of this organization and try to exact revenge and take the place he thinks he deserves in the hierarchy of this particular organization or order. And that throughout the story, although these are running somewhat on parallel tracks, they ultimately coalesce in the end with a very climactic ending, but also a very tragic ending. I don't want to go further than that for fear of spoiling the end of Ruination. Those are the three main characters that we follow in this story, particularly Callista and Urlock Grail. King Viego is there in the background, his constant presence. People are talking about him, people are worried about him, people are plotting behind his back. But the main focus tends to be Callista and Urlock Grail. But again, there are subplots sprinkled throughout. There are several characters that League of Legends players, League of Legends fans will recognize, some of whom play larger roles than others. One in particular I would say is more of an Easter egg more so than a major player, whether it's in the main plots or the subplots. But there is a lot here for those of keen eye to find and see from the video game and some of the lore that's been explained, offered in other venues, other forms of media. Having said that, I found the review for this book to be a little complex, potentially complicated, because I really do think the level of background knowledge that a reader brings to this novel will determine how they view this novel. Certainly, that was the case for me. In my opinion, as someone who's played League of Legends, who played League of Legends before I read this novel, had a general idea of the characters of Viego, Callista, Hecarim, and others that show up before I started reading Ruination. I found this novel to simply be fairly similar, if not downright redundant, of the other stories and anecdotes that are out there about these characters released by the creators of League of Legends. And so this, for me, having that background knowledge, felt a little tedious because it's really the same story I knew beforehand, just spread out over 400 to 500 pages. And I think, for me, this is where this novel falls short of the standard at which I held it, which was really those Warcraft novels I talked about earlier, because for me, these tie-in novels really excel when they expand the lore, when they enrich the characters and the stories that we already know from the games that we've played. That is knowledge we are bringing with us into these particular novels. And so for these particular novels to be effective, for me, as someone who's already got some background knowledge of these particular worlds, characters, stories, these novels really need to expand on what already exists in some material way, or just present a wholly new story in these worlds with new characters, or even division between new characters and old characters. And I really don't think Ruination does that effectively. This really did feel like it was just telling me the same story I already knew, just in a longer form. Having said that, I think for readers who do not have any familiarity with the video game, with these particular characters, they are going to enjoy this book, because I think Anthony Reynolds' writing is good. It was enjoyable to read. I thought it was well paced. I did like the ending, even though I knew what was coming. I thought it was told very well. It did keep me on the edge of my seat. And so I certainly recommend, particularly for those viewers who have no familiarity with League of Legends, to certainly give this a try. It's a quick read. It's a really interesting read. I hesitate to say a fun read, because this really is a story of tragedy. And that is one of the aspects of the plot I really did like. And I want to praise for Ruination and for its author, Anthony Reynolds, is because it did not shy away from the tragedy of the stories of these characters. And while there is a thread of hope offered near the end, it really did end, I think, the appropriate way, in the sense that this was telling a tragic story, and it did not try to remove itself from that. It leaned into that. And so I certainly think that is the strongest aspect of this particular book's plot, its story. Alongside the ending, I also thought the characters of Callista and Urlot Grail, although they're two completely different characters, generally speaking on different arcs in this particular story, even though it's clear from the outset of this book, these stories are going to overlap, they're going to collide at some point in this book. They were written well. I particularly liked Callista's journey, as I mentioned, getting out, seeing more of this world, the different denizens of this world, the different cultures of this world, the different cities of this world. I found that really interesting and really fun to go along on this journey with Callista. Urlot Grail's journey was very interesting. I think that Anthony Reynolds really gets across the cunning nature of this particular character, the intellect of this particular character, and really does a good job setting Urlot Grail up as a foil, as an antagonist, as a villain of this story and of this world. And so I think in terms of the two main characters, I thought they were really well done, really well written, really interesting to follow. Even as someone who already knew, generally speaking, where this was all going to end up, where these characters were going to end up. I thought there could have been more done with King Viego. For much of this story, as I alluded to, he's in the background. People speak more about him than we actually read about him. And although he makes more of an appearance as the story progresses, I felt he was very absent. And I felt the absence in this particular story. And it also felt very one-dimensional in that he lurched from one emotion, one state of being, to another without really any explanation or depiction of those transitions. And so ultimately, I really felt like Viego's story could have been strengthened, could have been bolstered in this particular book. Having said that, my final thoughts about this book, I really do think that it depends on your background knowledge of this property, of these stories, of these characters. I didn't hate this book. I don't regret picking this book up and reading this book. As hopefully I've expressed, there were parts of this book I did like, particularly the third act of this story. I thought it ended on a high note, notwithstanding generally having an idea of how this story was going to end. I still thought it was action-packed, it was adrenaline-filled, and it was well written. So even if you got some knowledge of these characters, of the story of League of Legends, and you're looking for something to read, something that ties into that world, I think potentially Ruination could be a book for you. If you are not familiar with these characters, with this story, I definitely recommend picking up Ruination because, as I mentioned, it's an interesting read. It can be a fun read at times. It's a quick read. I really like that. I think it's very accessible for avid readers of fantasy, new readers of fantasy, and those that fall somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. So, generally speaking, I would give this a 5 out of 10. And the reason why I give it a 5 out of 10 is because of my previous knowledge of the story, and that this really, as I mentioned, is just kind of a retelling of those events with very little deviations, it seems to me, in a longer form. If I hadn't come to this story, this book, with that prior knowledge, I think I would have rated this book higher. As I said, I did like the writing of it, I did like the pacing of it, several of the characters in it. So, there's my ranking, there's my rating, my final recommendation. Should viewers of this channel, should viewers of this video pick up Ruination? Should this be the ancillary media about the world of League of Legends that you should check out? Yes, but only after you've seen Arcane. Because I think Arcane is a way better introduction, a way better story of these worlds. Certainly takes place in a different element, a different milieu, a different area of this world. But if you could only take in, view, read one form of League of Legends content, I would definitely make it Arcane. But if you have more time and you do like this world, definitely try Ruination, pick it up, check it out. If you liked this book review, if you're looking for additional book reviews, reviews of movies, television shows, video games, potentially conventions, please hit that subscribe button. We will continue to post those reviews to this channel. We also have a podcast that we release weekly. We upload those here on YouTube as well as other places you find podcasts like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So please hit the subscribe button. Please check out our podcast. And please jump into the comments below. Let me know what you thought about Ruination if you have read it. Or if you're looking forward to reading it down the road, let me know that as well. And as always, if you agree with my opinions, let me know in the comments. If you disagree with my opinions, please also let me know in the comments, and we can have that discussion and dialogue about one of the things we love the most, fantasy and science fiction books. With that, for today, the Pop Docs Clinic is officially closed.